But first, everyone agrees that the objective of workplace relations reform should be more jobs with higher pay for workers. That's where the agreement ends. How that's best achieved is at the heart of the differences between the Liberal Party and Labor. Liberals see business as a partnership between owners, managers and workers, where higher profits should mean higher wages too. Labor sees business as a contest, often adversarial, between bosses and workers, where workers are often lucky to get the crumbs from the boss's table. Liberals want less regulation because regulation just makes it harder to run a business efficiently and to deploy staff effectively and to make the profit needed to pay staff well. Labor invariably wants more regulations, or at least is suspicious, very suspicious of moves to cut regulation, because regulation is needed, they say, to stop the bosses ripping off the workers. Now, the truth is that some bosses would rip off their workers if they thought they could get away with it. That's a long way from all. But unless the business makes a profit, it can't keep going. And the net result of all of that is, if the business goes under, well, everyone ends up out of work. As always, the challenge is to get the balance right. And invariably, the coalition wants to move things forward towards more freedom, while Labor's always looking for examples of unfairness, so it can pile on more penalties to bad bosses. There are two specific problems right now. The pandemic has damaged businesses, especially in tourism and hospitality, wanting to cut their costs in order to survive. That's the first. And the second issue is wage calculation. Now, given all the award classifications, all the loadings, different pay rates, it's all become so complicated that even the very sophisticated businesses, such as Qantas and Woolies, they can end up unwittingly underpaying staff. So what hope do mum and dad operations have if the big guys get into trouble? How can the small guys stay within the law? It's not easy. Now, scarred by the loss of the 2007 election, essentially over a union scare campaign that the Howard government wanted to cut wages, ever since then the coalition has largely steered away from workplace relations reform. The only changes proposed by the Abbott government, for instance, were the restoration of the strong cop on the beat to police the construction industry, and nothing much at all from Abbott's successor. Now the Morrison government has dipped its toe back into the IR water with some modest proposals to fine-tune the system. First, it wants to allow part-time workers in the hospitality industry the ability to substitute higher standard hourly rates for overtime. Second, it wants to allow more flexibility and durability in enterprise deals for big projects. And third, and this is where the controversy is, it wants to allow some pandemic-hit businesses to bypass the Better Off Overall test, or BOOT test it's called, for any changes to wages and conditions in order for the businesses to survive, arguing that Better Off Overall, that test means little if you end up losing your job altogether in order to meet it. Now, naturally, to prove it's not anti-worker, the government's bill has heavier penalties, including criminal penalties for employers willfully making a mistake in relation to paying their staff. And just as predictably, Labor is crying foul over the proposal to sidestep this BOOT test, even though its own legislation from 2009, I was there at the time, allows for businesses to sidestep the BOOT test under limited circumstances. Now, even though the package was supposed to be negotiated over months and months with unions and employer groups, it's this third provision in relation to the Better Off Overall test, or the BOOT test, that was inserted at the last minute at the request of business and a surprise to the ACTU.
You talk about dialogue though. Where was the dialogue on the BOOT with the unions? Why did you blindside them? Or do you accept your blindside them?
I don't accept that at all. I mean, some of the features of the bill occurred later than others, but that particular feature of the bill was provided to the ACTU in draft. It also went through the formal process which is known as COIL, which is a MINCO group that has all of the stakeholders in IR who are consulted in it. It was inside the last 2 weeks, but that's not unusual. But
do you concede that if you consulted further, if you had consulted earlier or better on that, you'd have more of a chance of getting it?
No, I don't actually. And maybe this is the difference between my game and yours. Some issues you can consult on endlessly and not reach resolution.
History will show if workplace relations reform is to please all the vested interests, we're not going to get much of it. Although, to be fair to the government, it did pass this week, with Labor's support, and to Labor's credit, they supported this, changes to allow the militant CFMEU to de-merge. Now, this won't actually tackle the problem of militancy in the construction industry. That bill, the fit and proper person test, was dropped a couple of months ago as a peace offering to the ACTU by the government to get them to the table mid-pandemic, but it should at least stop disputes in the construction sector contaminating workplace relations in sectors such as forestry and mining. Now, even if only a heavily amended version of the government's current bill is to pass early in the new year, I suppose it will be a small step in the right direction. What it certainly won't do, as a glance at the hundreds of pages of draft legislation and explanatory memoranda makes clear, is to really simplify the system. And simplifying workplace relations, what you pay people, all the rules associated with HR, all of that needs simplification, and that's exactly what small business is crying out for. They want to be able to pay workers a fair wage, everyone working productively, and not fall foul of rules which get them into a lot of trouble. For small businesses at least, those employing, say, 20 or fewer staff and operating almost like a family, why don't we as a country increase hourly rates, only pay overtime when total hours exceed full-time hours, and abolish all the other rules about who can do what? Make it as simple as we can, or at least those that want that sort of free system to be able to opt into it. Now, that'd be a reform worth fighting for, but it seems altogether too brave for this ultra-cautious government, and I understand that. There's a lot of hangover from the work choices era. But this is becoming now an opportunity for an opposition spoiling for a fight on something that might finally rally Labor's demoralised troops.